But it's been a good progress of our in progress. Let's start doing the busyness. It's gonna be nice in a way because you can have some calories.
Sherry?
See the impact, right?
If you need to know bases and you don't need to know. I get it. Okay. That's all cool.
Recording in progress.
There we go. Okay, my apologies. We're about 35 minutes past the start of our Regional Hospital District Board meeting. First, I'd like to acknowledge that we're meeting on the traditional territory of the Tla'amin people. And the first item of order is, well, call to order, which I've just done. And the second item is approval of the agenda. You've all received the agenda, moved by Director Brander, seconded by Director Isaacson. Any additions or changes? Seeing none, going to call the question. All in favor? None opposed. That's carried. On to item number 3, adoption of the minutes. First, are there any errors or omissions? Seeing none, looking for a mover. Director Brander, Director Isaacson. All in favor? Opposed? None. That is carried. Delegation inquiries. I don't see any official delegation on our agenda. Are there any unofficial delegations potentially online? Seeing none, we have no unfinished business. On to correspondence. 6.1, and there is business arising from correspondence, which is item 7.1. So moving right along, we have a recommended motion from our staff. Who would like to move it, or do we want to have a brief discussion before we get into the motion itself?
Oh, the recommendation.
Okay, moved by Director Brander, seconded by Director McCormick. Okay, floor is open for discussion. Who would like to go first? Director Paul.
I think the recommendation makes a lot of sense because this is a big request. The staff eyes on it would be great.
Wonderful. Any other input? Seeing none, I'm going to throw myself onto the speakers list. When I took a look at the request for funding, because they've gone over budget, it appears that Miklat requires $553,000 to complete their project. The BC government has provided $300,000. My thoughts are, as usually when we do capital funding, province provides 60% funding, and we usually provide 40%. So I would be willing to provide, I believe, $341,000 if the provincial government would pony up the other $211,000. But that's just my thought. That doesn't mean I'm against the motion. It's still going to go to our staff. Any other? Oh,
Sorry, Chair.
That's okay. We are on item 7.1. And if there's no one else wishing to speak to this item, I'm going to call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? None. That is carried. Okay, chair's report. Oh, that's me. Yeah, I'll be relatively quick. As per the direction received at the December Regional Hospital District Board meeting, when BC Housing and LIFT attended the City Council of Powell River meeting for presentations and questions, I attended and approached the council as the chair of the hospital district, and I informed council of the language of our motion from the December 18th, indicating our commitment for working together. I provided a copy of the adopted resolution to their corporate officer and clarified that the motion was adopted in a public meeting. Additionally, I made an in-person contact with Naomi, a representative from BC Housing, and oh, hold on. The report just disappeared. There it is. Naomi representing BC Housing. I have since submitted a formal request for acquiring a copy of the operations contract between BC Housing and LIFT in relation to the service delivery occurring at 4910 Joyce Avenue, which is hospital district property. Now, the request for information may come before us in a closed meeting or a public meeting. I put Naomi with our corporate officers so that the appropriate next steps can be taken in accordance with provincial legislation and our own procedures. We also had a working group meeting last week on the 20th. A brief overview. All parties have now signed off on our terms of reference. What was referred to as the master plan is now being referred to as the health visioning plan. So if you start hearing those different language, that should hopefully make sense. Our timeline to get it started has been pushed back into 2026. I just want to point out that when speaking with other chairs of Sea to Sky and Sunshine Coast, the health visioning master plan, whatever we want to call it, they have some regrets as to the hospital districts not putting forward their priorities before the plan got underway. Because Vancouver Coastal Health has kind of been taking the lead, and they have kind of felt that maybe the hospital district didn't give enough of their, from the balcony broad perspectives to begin with. Do 1 sec. Oh yeah. Also, I would also suggest that we re-express our interest to have a joint strategic planning session with the Sunshine Coast Regional Hospital District and the Sea to Sky Regional Hospital District. That was a motion that we passed quite a while ago, and I'm working with the other chairs to potentially move forward with such an event on the Central Coast. The next item, we had an update on the status of projects, primarily emergency room renovations and the pharmacy renovations nearing completion. And they are getting underway with changes to the triage emergency waiting room renovations to improve patient privacy. Reminds me of an old joke of the old man that goes into the clinic. I won't say it here, but you can look it up. Additionally, this is a big one for members of the public and the board, issue of parking or the lack thereof. I was informed that the staff specific parking is being expanded in the gravel area up by the 3rd floor entrance, and that should result in fewer parking spaces being taken up by the hospital staff, and thus hopefully more parking being made available for patients and visitors. Additionally, for Lasqueti Island, as a follow-up to the December 18th meeting, I reached out to the Nanaimo Regional Hospital District Chair and asked for the point of contact with VHA. I was provided a name and email. I sent the individual an email seeking connection and communication back in January. I did not hear back. At last week's working group meeting, I asked Michelle Hanna if she had any other contact information, and she gave me more appropriate contacts with 2 individuals from VHA who may be better suited to assist the hospital district and the Lasqueti Island Last Resort Society with our shared concerns. I've since reached out to them both and look forward to hearing back. As soon as I do, I will reach out to Director Fall and the Lasqueti Last Resort Society board representative. That's the end of my report. Go ahead, Director Fall.
Thank you. Thank you, Chair. I was going to acknowledge the efforts of the chair on reaching out to the chair of the regional district in Nanaimo Hospital District. On my way up here, coincidentally, yesterday at the dock, I met with 2 members of the Last Resort Society and the Island Health coordinator of site operations, who would come over to Lasqueti Islands to visit with the Last Resort, see the Judith Fisher's Health Center, Lasqueti Health Center, and make discussions. So it was only a brief encounter because they were just on the dock. It was at the ferry, but it was very good. It was good to see. So I suggested to her that if it seemed appropriate, that she could delegate to us and then inform us a little bit more about, the complications and nuances and fun of Lasqueti being in a separate hospital district. So yes, so I think it's really good. It's positive, and there's a better connection, and the Last Resort Society board members were quite happy.
Wonderful. And for any members of the public that aren't aware, our regional hospital district is primarily serviced by Vancouver Coastal Health, with the exception of Electoral Area E, which is part of Vancouver Island Health Authority, which is kind of a remnant, as I understand, from when this hospital district used to be part of Vancouver Island Health Authority. So we cover 2 areas. So thank you very much for that information, Director Fall. Are there any other questions in relation to the chair's report? Seeing none, I will move on to the consent agenda, which we have none. Resolutions, there's none. Reports, Vancouver Coastal Health cost share request, and the Last Resort Society request for funding. How would we like to proceed on item 12.1, VCH capital cost share request? There's a couple of options in the package.
We'll move option 1.
Okay, Director Lennox has moved option 1, seconded by Director McCormick. Feel free to open for discussion, Director Lennox.
Yeah, thanks, Chair. I think, definitely VCH has been waiting quite a while for us to make a decision on the cost share request. And we had a good discussion in our financial meetings about reserve funds and all the different, some of the options we have. And, I speak for myself. I've heard it from others, the frustration of these large cost share requests that keep coming every year instead of being part of asset management and planning. So that's not really anything we can do other than voice our dissatisfaction and try to get these identified in the report as well, right? And but I think this is our option to not burden our taxpayers even more, is to use our reserve funds for this. I do see in the report Many of these actions have already been undertaken, completed, or substantially complete. If you go to the ER or to others, you'll see it. Not necessarily the best outcome, but many of these things have been done. So our citizens are getting the benefit of these actions, and it's our turn to see if we want to pay for it. Thanks.
Yep. Anyone else? Paul?
Thank you, Chair. I support the motion as well. I think it's appropriate, but I do have a question. So the motion from option 1 is that the board approve 40% contribution of the 1.4 million. And so just to clarify with the manager of through the chair, the manager of financial services, at the very beginning of the report, it says to consider a 40% cost share request of 791,756. And then these different tables of our 40%, for example, on page the discussion and analysis, it shows the cost share 40% is 100,059. So I just want to be clear where how these numbers are related to. So it's 40% of 40% of the 3.5 million in that table is 1.4 million. It says 797, and the motion itself says 40% of 1.4. So I just want to be clear what we're.
Yes, that was kind of a little bit of confusion as well. My assumption would be that 40% is ultimately 1.4 million, and it's not 40% of 1.4 million. But I see we have Linda Green on our screen, and she can clarify what murkiness we have. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair. I apologize. That is in the purpose summary. That is a typo. I think I just did a cut and paste from a former report and the 791,756. So that is not a number that should be considered here. The number that you will be looking at is the 1,411,059.
Thank you, Ms. Green. And that's what I thought. And because putting the information together, I was pretty clear about it. But just because, I'm a math person, I like things to do the multiplication in my head. So it's what we're 1.4 million is what we're talking about.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Okay, Director Isaacson.
Yeah, thank you, Chair. I'm not the usual person at this table, so forgive me if this sort of question has been asked before. What are the possible implications of saying, actually, we'll give you 30%? I think if there's been any discussion to that extent, given the frustration with the process, is there any way to nudge them to take a different approach in the future?
I will initially address that in the political side of things. In communication with the Sea to Sky Hospital District, they were unhappy with Vancouver Coastal Health's processes, and I believe for 2 years in a row they denied funding requests, and that kind of changed Vancouver Coastal Health's tune, but not as much, of course, as we would all hope. But I do believe also our manager of financial planning might also have some input as to what would happen if we said, 30% or 25% or something like that. I guess it would be, that's what we give them. Go ahead, floor is yours.
Thank you, Chair, through the chair. I did talk to Johan Murray from Vancouver Coastal Health about what would happen if we didn't fund this at all. And he said what happens is Vancouver Coastal Health, when they prioritize their projects, they're putting them in priority order, what needs to be done. And so he said, if we didn't fund this, then what would happen is the province would fund the shortfall. And then they would have to look at the other projects that are planned and figure out how they can, then rejig some of those projects. They might look, across the whole region to figure out what projects could they then put off, because we're funding more of these projects from the province's envelope of funding. So the same would be true if the board decided to fund 30%, then they would have to figure out, okay, where are we going to get the other 10% of the funding? What projects does that have to be rejigged to accommodate that?
Yes. And so that's kind of my understanding, is if we say turn down funding, then it slows down potential other capital improvements within our hospital facilities, like in the future years, where they say, okay, we had to use up extra amount of dollars to finish last year's project, and therefore in the future, like their capital plan would be scaled back because, well, they only have so much money in their pool, if that makes sense. I think that's my understanding.
Yes, yes.
Anyone else? Seeing no hands, I'm going to call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? None. That is carried. On to 12.0.
Just a quick comment. There's a typo in cut and paste of section 20 of the act in line 5, I believe it is. The third word in line 5 should be which, not with.
Okay.
And it's it's totally incidental, but I couldn't figure out what that line meant, so I looked in the act and I discovered that the words were off.
Sharp eyes.
Well, I was trying to understand it. Thank you.
Thank you, Director Southcott. And just for clarification, that is in relation to the staff report of 12.1. Okay, moving on to 12.2, Last Resort Society request for funding. Director Fall.
Thank you, Chair. And I'd really like to start by thanking staff for the comprehensive report. This is a complicated thing we asked, and it was really comprehensive and of course not as simple as ever we can do. So I'm going to actually have two motions. I'm going to forward. It's clear. So the first one I'll put forward is the first part of option 1, which is that the board approve a contribution of $9,457.15 towards the Lasky Last Resort Society's battery replacement project, estimated at $70,000, and that the board approve an amendment to the Regional Hospital District 2025 budget to reflect the contribution and funding from the reserve.
Seconded. Okay, that's moved and seconded. And just checking with our CAO/corporate officer today. Have you got that okay?
Yeah, that was option 1, right?
Yeah,
Option one, the first two clauses.
Without the last section. Yeah. So that's cool. Perfect. Okay, go ahead, Director.
Yeah, I'll just address this first. I'll deal with this second part in a moment. I think I really appreciate the effort put in to calculate these numbers, and on the Last Resort Society for helping staff with the percentages, because it's a complicated setup. There's the health center itself that you've all seen. There's a number of cottages. There's 3 elder cottages. There's a service building that houses the Lasky Internet Access Society office, and it has the heater and the batteries and the solar panels. So that's a kind of shared amount. So the percentages are basically the percentages of the floor, or the costs for the different service users there. And then the service area building is divided proportionally because it's costs money to run that, but everyone pays a little bit. So the batteries provide service for everyone. And I should point out that the batteries in the power system also provides the fire hall and the recycling depot in our free store. Now there's a separate issue about funding, appropriate funding or costs recovery from that, but that's another story for another time. But really that's paid for through the management service and through the VFD service. So they're paying for that, and that's separate from this. We heard from Dr. Ron Abrams and the Last Resort Society, they would, cost them $70,000. They're looking for compensation for that. They had someone front some money, but not permanently. It wasn't a donation. So this is as good as can be done from the hospital district. I've tried to make a good pitch that, Lasky pays into it. Rural health centers paying into rural health centers saves money at the hospital because people don't necessarily go. If you save one person can stay on the island instead of going to the emergency room or take a helicopter. That can save a lot more than this. So hopefully I hope the board can support this amount, but it's so small, which is why I'll unfortunately, in a way, and it's just the way it is, it's only get some really small way towards, which I'll consider in a moment. So what I will do, and I'm just planting a seed for the future, I think this discussion continues about how to support them. I know they have a lot more operational or capital needs coming down the road. And if the amount they're able to tap into through the hospital district is 13%, then I will be encouraging them, and the board can expect other applications in the future to hopefully recover a little bit for when they start replacing other things like roofs and water pumps and so on. They got a lot of infrastructure there. So but that's off topic right now. I hope the board can support this amount, $9,000 from our reserves.
Okay. Anyone else? I'll just jump in, and the only thing I'm going to say is I'm in support of this motion. The one thing was similar to the Miklat funding. I really wish that the province would also provide 60% of the funding for these kind of costs. But of course, this one is with Vancouver Island Health Authority, so I don't think we can really pull the funding from Vancouver Coastal Health and maybe get the same results. But other than that, that's it for me. With that, I'm going to call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? None. That is carried. And you have a second motion?
Yes, so it's going to be a modification of the one that's there, which is that the request for funding from the Lasqueti Last Resort Society be forwarded to the March 26 Regional District Board meeting. And I'll just leave it there, actually. Well, maybe I could actually, let me not quite leave it there. Strike out the words to consider funding the 60,542 balance of the required funding and just add through electoral area grant and aid. So the request be forwarded to the March 26th district board meeting to consider funding through the electoral area grants and aid.
Okay. I think that makes sense.
That makes sense. So it's just striking out. Does the CAO have that, or corporate officer?
Yeah, he's got.
If I get a seconder, I'll
Our chief administrative corporate officer. Okay, seconded by Director Lennox. Go ahead.
So my idea here, I mean, our whole electoral area grants and aid is something like $11,000.
Yes.
And way back before this contribution service existed, the Last Resort Society asked the regional board of the day if they could have funding, ongoing funding through grants and aid. And the answer was no, because that's capital. You know, when they were building, go ask the hospital district. So Last Resort went to the hospital district, and the hospital district said, yeah, okay, but you need a contribution service. You have to have a referendum. So then we had the referendum, and now we've got the service. Now, there is an issue with the service establishment bylaw, which could be rectified in the future, and that is that the service establishment bylaw, the 45,000, can only be used for operations, not capital. That could assist in some ways with flexibility to take that out, but I don't want to entertain opening the service establishment bylaw without more reasons than just that, because that won't help them in this case, because it turns out they, not surprised, they need their $45,000 for their operation. So allowing them to spend that $45,000 on capital is not going to help them, because they say, okay, we still don't have enough money. So what I would like to be doing, and I'll be brief here because of time, I would probably be more open to matching the funding that's coming from the reserves from the hospital district. So, and not, you know, the Last Resort Society will have to apply through the grants and aid. It will require a, you know, overriding a bit our policy on grants and aid because it is for capital. And there's also the issue of, you know, that there was a referendum, so there's political tension if if too much is given and so on without actually going to referendum. So that's all discussion at the board. So I think if we just go with this, we can, I'll carry on with this debate at the board meeting.
I was about to jump in and go, this is starting to get into.
Really, this is just hand it over and then we'll see tomorrow.
Okay, sounds good. The motion is that we refer the remaining funding request over to the regional district meeting, which I believe is tomorrow, and checking with our CIO, I believe they can do that within the time frame. Okay, any other discussion on this item? Seeing none, I'm going to call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? None. That is carried. Okay, now that gets us on to bylaws 13.1. Who would like to move the first reading?
First reading.
Okay. Does this one need to be read out loud? Probably. It should be.
That the board give first and second reading of the Regional Hospital District 2025 to 2029 Financial Plan Bylaw number 134/2025.
Moved by Director Fall, seconded by Director Lennox. Any discussion? Being none, going to call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? None. That is carried. Second one.
I'll move that the board give third reading of the Regional Hospital District 2025 to 2029 Financial Plan Bylaw number 134/2025.
Seconded by Director Lennox. All in favor? Any opposed? None. That is carried.
And I'll move that the board adopt Regional Hospital District 2025 to 2029 Financial Plan Bylaw number 134/2025.
Seconded by Director Lennox. And anyone wishing to speak to this item before we move to adoption? Seeing none, I'm going to call the question. All in favor? Any opposed? None. That is carried. We have now just adopted our 2025 Hospital District Financial Plan. I hope that makes our manager of financial services happy. Thank you for all the good work that you've done to get us here.
Maybe a thumbs up.
Good. Thumbs up. With that, there is no items of new business unless someone has something very burning on them. Doesn't appear to be. Question period.
Hello, Chair Galinsky from the Peak here. I don't have any questions this afternoon. Thanks for the opportunity.
Thank you. And there is no proposed closed session, so we're not going in camera. Rise and report, there is none. And that brings us to adjournment as we have finished our agenda. Thank you very much for coming and have a good evening.